Hi everyone, it's Jerry. I have another dynamic game to share with you from the 2024 FIDE candidates. This is a round 3 game between Gujrathi on the white end and our Praggnanandhaa. Let's have a look. On board, Ray Lopez, a6, bishop a4, and only now do we have f5. So this is the delayed Schliemann defense. The regular Schliemann is without a6 and bishop a4 included. So one note we could make with this delayed version is that black is now only one move away, b5, from addressing the pressure this bishop has on this diagonal. Once b5 is in, bishop has to go elsewhere. Let's see how play shapes up in the center. d4, e takes d, and now FIDE establishes an alpha 0 pawn in the position, e5. This is disruptive to the black side. The king knight, in particular, robbed now of its favorite square, has this cramping effect on black. Now, from years back, those Alpha Zero versus Stockfish games, Alpha Zero was a big fan, time and time again, loved to establish a pawn on this e5 square. And in those games, it would come about from a static position, for instance, out of a French defense advanced variation. In those positions, there would be a black pawn on e6 restricting the e-pawn's advance. Not the case here. It's a much more volatile situation ahead. The e-pawn can move, and as we will see in this game, does move more than once. It's going to be interesting and instructive to see how exactly Pragg handles this dynamic. He continues by trying to hunt the light square bishop. FIDE's reply on this move 8 is knight takes d4. Spent about 17 minutes on this decision. What else was he maybe considering? I imagine the queen recapture, or even bishop d5 provoking c6 and then swiping the king knight. Why would you maybe want to go with a variation like that, exchanging the bishop for the king knight? Well, you do gain that much more insight about the black king and where it will reside. If the rook is recapturing, you can't forget about kingside castles, of course. And if the bishop is exchanging for the king knight, this guy maybe looks a little bit silly on the edge, possibly tactically vulnerable. So there's a lot to consider here, to be sure. Now, one other note, if the queen takes on d4, here's a little trap to be familiar with. Right around the corner for black is this idea of c5, targeting the queen, and then c4 squashing the bishop. Noah's Ark trap. All right, in this game, white takes with the fearless piece, bishop b7, knight takes f, knight takes bishop, and this is now the big piece in the position, the unopposed light square bishop. The follow-up is d6, targeting the alpha 0 pawn right away. The g-pawn is poison. Let's see why. Rook g1, bishop runs away, queen check, only move, rook takes pawn. If you take like this, we're not taking the rook, we're taking the king. That's mate. All right. Poison g-pawn. In the game, it is d6. On the surface, when you see d6, you may think to yourself, Pragg is okay taking on an isolated d-pawn. This is not true. If white takes on d6, in the game it's queen e2. If white takes on d6, black's not going to recapture. Instead, he's going to first shoo this knight away, and once it leaves, then he's going to recapture with the bishop. Do know in this position, if white inserts the check, the king is cool uncastled on the f7 square. No way to get at him, no white light square bishop around to bother the king. White still has to address this threat, and as mentioned, once the knight runs away, convenient recapture, and this is where black has compensation for the pawn. These two monster bishops working in tandem towards the king side. All right. In this game, it is queen e2. Black maintains the tension here. Is not interested in inviting the queen into e5. He takes a step up with the queen. He's inviting, 12 moves in, a passed e-pawn, and that's exactly what we see. e6, queen c6. Rare, 12 moves in to have a passed e-pawn. Also know, after these 12 moves, clock situation. FIDE has now just under an hour, and Pragg has about an hour and 38 minutes. I believe time will continue to be a big factor with this event, having no increment for the first 40 moves, just the 2 hours. It's a tough adjustment. So where do we go from here? Well, the follow-up is bishop g5, and I can't help but wonder to myself, does a player maybe kind of laugh internally once you figure out certain variations? There's a big trick here that FIDE has up his sleeve with bishop g5. The g-pawn is still poisoned here. It seems that much more, taking on g2 here seems attractive. Now with the bishop on g5, this would be a big blunder. Targets the rook, targets the bishop, but it's a big blunder. Why exactly? Feel free to pause the video and figure out why. Okay, it's a checkmate in 3. It kicks off with knight takes g7. Black's replies are only moves. Gotta take the knight. Queen h5 check. That sacrifice has eliminated the pawn that was prepared to block the queen h5 check. Bishop can't block here. Only move, king f8. Scholar's mate style. Queen f7 mate. That is a cool sequence. All right, Pragg is not going to bite. What does he do? He says, get out of my house, knight, and you too, bishop. And now he continues to develop. First blockading the passed pawn with the knight. c4 met nicely with b4, restricting the queen knight. Doesn't have access to its favorite square. It's actually down to now only one good square, d2. Queen g4. An active post. A restriction is now placed on the knight. Has to defend g6. And I guess in a way, white is saying you might want to think twice about castling queenside. There could be some tactics. King does end up on c8 after queenside castles. All right, queen c5. Bishop now has direct sight of d5. Should this knight want to drop in here and try and dislodge the blockading piece? From here, kingside castles, bishop g7, where else for the queen knight? And now we do have queenside castles. I like this decision. Computer says you could go in either direction. I do like queenside for what reason? I see it as a perfectly healthy kingside structure, even though there isn't a black pawn on b7. In a way, I kind of see it as a pawn, this bishop on b7, a pawn and a bishop. It's a multi-purpose bishop. Functions just like a pawn and then some, targeting the heart of white's kingside structure. From here, it is h4, move 20, and the reply is rook on f to e8. So after these 20 moves, FIDE now has only 20 minutes remaining, and Pragg has about 48 minutes. I'd like to point out that this h4 move, not really considered the best in the computer's eyes. What does the computer want to play here? It suggests diving into d5 right away, trying to eliminate this knight, do something along this diagonal, move the pawn with the discovered check, in other words. The follow-up here being knight takes, and you could insert the check right away or even capture the knight. In what way does white benefit with a line like this? A new line has opened up towards the king, and there is value in that, in these opposite sides castles position. Very common to pitch a pawn in order to open a line for a rook or two. All right, now this h4 move, it's risky to be sure. I mean, if it's a bullet game, I think one of the top moves, a bullet player maybe thinks of here. Of course, this is not a bullet game, but this idea to play g5 and a fork is there. A file is likely to now be cracked open towards the king. G5 isn't the best here. Pragg does play one of the very best moves with rook f to e8. If g5 was played in this position, what's considered best is bishop h2. And if black takes here, this is not considered best. You could play that move, although it certainly seems very risky, with black being able to coordinate on g2. It says white is winning here, with these white knights now pouncing in the position. There's a lot of stuff happening here. Possible discoveries once this knight is no longer around. If this knight is captured, a new file opens up towards the king. Possible sacrifices on d6. This is considered a winning position for white. So not a direction to go in, really, with g5 and this, but later on, it can certainly be an idea. Pragg plays in, he takes, I guess you can say, a safety first approach. He's addressing a possible tactic on this diagonal. Now, if this knight is no longer around and this pawn advances, it will be check, but the rook is no longer going to be under fire. So security first with the rook on e8. Rook on a to d1. And now we have bishop takes on b2. So why isn't Vidit defending this pawn? Well, I mean, it's too passive. I guess that's the short answer. How valuable is a rook, really, if all it's doing is babysitting the pawn? It's not really a good position to have the rook in here. He has a more active plan in mind. He's setting up a knight drop into this d5 square next. Pragg goes ahead and takes that b pawn, and this is not an insignificant pawn. It's a doubled pawn, but without that b2 pawn around, now there is this big gap on c3. It's a hole. Black's furthest pawn is already there controlling it. This is an excellent place to now park this dark square bishop. Additionally, we can factor in majorities on the queen side. Don't underestimate that. It is now down to, 4 versus 2, tipping in Team Black's favor. All right, the follow-up here, I guess the consistent follow-up to rook on a to d1, knight d5, knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, and in this position, the bishop recaptures. If the queen recaptures, do know this is not a mate threat. Queen is there covering, and black would simply be running into knight c4. Queen is hit, and the bishop would be hit. So it's the bishop who recaptures. Discovered check with the e-pawn, and the king goes to b8. So I think if you want to, one of the ways you could certainly improve as a player is really trying to determine on your own, which square is better for the king in this situation. Pragg spent a few minutes on this 24th move. He plays king to b8. I believe b7 would be a better square if, let's say, black can be assured of a queen exchange within the next move or two, because the king would, in an endgame, like to play an active role, start to come up to the b5 square to help escort these this queenside majority. But in this situation, the queens are on board. Playing to b8 is better, maybe because you want to stay off of this diagonal. Who knows, maybe this guy isn't going to be around. It may want to exchange itself for the knight at some stage. The queen could maybe bother the king if he's on b7. Also, do know the bishop has fallback squares with the king on b8. Stays out of the bishop's way. Could go to b7 or even a8. So these are some things to maybe factor in trying to decide, do I go to b8 or b7? b8 in this game, we follow with bishop e3, queen b5, knight c4, bishop c3, bishop d4, and now we have rook on h to g8. Now, it considers it around an even position here. The computer's suggestion is to play rook h7, but when you play that, there should be some red flags. The rooks are no longer in direct contact with one another. There's an unprotected rook on h7, and there is this sharp line I'd like to highlight. If rook h7 is played, here's one path for white. Can take on c3, and then this bolt out of the blue, knight takes d6. What's the idea? Well, it's to follow up with queen takes g6. This is not a winning continuation for white. This is still considered good for black, but there's a lot you would need to see if you're going to be playing in this way with rook h7. Do you see what's happening after queen g6? We're hitting the rook and d6. So if the rook moves, let's say here, there's queen takes d6, check, and this is how white gets the piece back, this fork. Apparently, though, for Team Black in this very position, in order to be a little bit better, you go ahead and take on g2. Not the easiest continuation to be calculating here. Could still go in a couple different ways from here, but this is a pretty wild continuation to be sure. In short, some red flags should register in your mind if you're going to go with a move like this. You're placing a rook on an unprotected square. Black is potentially more tactically vulnerable. All right, in this game, the rooks remain connected, and g6 is defended. No tricks on d6. Bishops are exchanged. Queen is central. 29 moves in. Let's get a few more in here. Queen takes c. Rook takes e. 30 moves are in, and the clock situation is very serious. Vidit now is down to about 4 minutes, and Pragg has 18 minutes. So Pragg has certainly managed his time better. The opening did end up costing Vidit a lot of time. I think Pragg was the better prepared, caught Vidit off guard out of the opening. And this is really coming back to bite Team White here. So let's get a few more moves in. Knight a5, rook e5. The computer suggests get rid of this bishop right now. White does not go for that. Plays b4. One of the first thoughts I had here, once the knight is on this square, I thought, why not just preserve the bishop? Doesn't this knight look silly? The bishop, watches over its advanced moves and goes that much further as well, targeting the king. White could follow up with rook d4, and there's this as an idea. So with Pragg's move in the game, rook to e5, he's saying, you got to do something about this knight right now. Well, the knight is defended with b4, but in a way, now the black king feels a little bit more comfortable, the black king and queen. There's no longer this idea of rook d4 to b4, with b4 occupied by a pawn. From here, we now have g5. So, trying to crack open the g file, this is a really difficult pawn push to deal with. You cannot allow the g file to open up. So White plays h5. Black continues to press. What's considered one of the better tries is rook to c1, targeting this. There is a way to conveniently defend it though. That's the computer suggestion. FIDE is way down on time at this stage. Plays rook on f to e1. The g-pawn continues to advance. It's gone by this point, to be sure. There's no good reaction to this pressure on f2. In the game, what do we have? It is knight takes bishop. What other try is there here for FIDE? If you capture the pawn or advance the pawn, black can play queen b6 check. So let's have a look at, let's say, a pawn advance, 1 or 2 steps. There would be a queen check, king in the corner, runs into mate, king to f1, runs into mate, and blocking with the queen would mean this rook is overloaded. 2 jobs, too many. Queen takes queen can follow, followed up with rook takes rook, mate. Also, let's look at what would happen if the pawn is actually captured. We would still have this check. Same tricks in the event of a queen block. King here, same story for mate. And if the king goes to f1, the king is getting hunted. After rook to f8, white has to give up the queen. It's reading as a checkmate in 4 from here. So no good way forward for team white. He takes the bishop. It's too late at this stage. Pragg inserts the in-betweener with check luring the king out. The white king is more vulnerable. White is down a pawn. Ideally, you don't want to exchange queens, but the white king is very vulnerable here. Queen f3 is played. Black's up a pawn, and soon he's going to be up a second pawn. No way to stop it. Queens are now off. The position has turned technical. No way to defend these 2 points. What is FIDE's try? He goes with g4 in the hopes of trying to track down this pawn and have a passed pawn, but Pragg is just not going to allow it. He goes after the h-pawn, wins that guy, does not give white time to take advantage of the pin on c7 with rook takes. Have to do something here. Rook d7. Black is now out of the pin along the 7th rank. Rook e7. The plan here, just trade a pair of rooks, make it technical, and that's going to be forced soon enough. In fact, after rook h to f5 check, FIDE resigns. If the game continued, we do get a pair of rooks off, keeping things squeaky clean. Rook-specific endgame, a rook and a bunch of pawns. And here's how we can make it really simple. Connected passers, the king is not cut off or anything. No problems ahead converting this, to be sure. But this is as far as it goes in this one. After rook h to f5, FIDE resigns. So what did you think of this one? This was an excellent game, in my opinion, and an excellent rebound for Pragg, who lost in round 2. So he's played some really exciting chess in all of his games in this event so far. Anyhow, feel free, as usual, to leave any feedback to this video in the comment section below. I hope you enjoyed it and maybe took a thing or two away. That's all for now. Take care.